Amen. The priest's voice was calm, solemn. The crowd murmured their final prayers as the cold wind swept through the cemetery. I stood among them, wrapped in shadows, my hands trembling under the weight of my own deception. I was buried today. Not my body, of course, but everything I was. My name, my past, my dreams, all lowered into the earth with a casket full of lies. I never thought I'd live to see my own funeral, but there I was, watching from the sidelines like a ghost that refused to rest. He was there too. He stood near the grave, tall and unshaken, dressed in a black suit that fit him like a second skin. His face was a perfect mask of grief, but I knew better. I knew the truth hidden behind his perfectly sculpted jaw and hollow eyes. He didn't mourn me. He mourned his possession, my fiancé, the man who once whispered promises of forever while holding me too tightly, the man who made me feel both adored and imprisoned, the monster I fell in love with and barely escaped. I watched him lay a white rose on the coffin, his fingers lingering for a moment too long. His lips moved, murmuring something only the grave could hear. And despite everything, a shiver ran down my spine. I remembered that touch. I remembered the way he used to trace my cheek as if I were a fragile work of art, before his grip would tighten. The love in his eyes always had sharp edges, and when his love turned dark, I knew. I had to disappear. I felt bile rise in my throat as I watched the tears roll down his face. Lies. All of it. How many times had I cried while he watched with that same expression of practiced calm? How many nights had I begged for space, for freedom, only to be pulled back into his suffocating world? The crowd began to disperse, umbrellas popping open against the drizzle. But he stayed, staring at the grave as though sheer will could bring me back. I almost laughed at the irony. I was closer to him now than ever, close enough to hear his ragged breath, close enough to smell the rain soaking into his coat. And yet, I was invisible. His voice broke through the patter of rain. "You thought you could run from me, didn't you?" The air caught in my lungs. No, he wasn't speaking to the grave. He was speaking to me. For a split second, our eyes met across the crowd. It felt like the world stopped spinning. The space between us, though crowded with people, seemed to narrow until nothing remained but the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. His lips curved into the faintest smile, a familiar, cruel smile. He knew. I stumbled back, my heart racing as if I'd been caught in a nightmare. My hands fumbled to pull the hood of my coat over my face, but it was too late. His gaze had found me, and with it, every carefully constructed piece of my new life came crashing down. For 2 years, I had planned my escape. I erased my presence, my name, my face. I became no one, a shadow, a ghost. But monsters, they always know how to hunt. The rain soaked my hair as I pushed past the crowd, my breath sharp with panic. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence behind me, a storm on the verge of breaking. Run. My mind screamed it like a war drum. Run before it's too late. But even as I ran, I knew. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when his eyes didn't send chills down my spine, but warmth through my heart. A time when I thought I had found the kind of love that people write stories about, the kind that makes you feel seen, cherished, and unbreakable. I remember the exact moment we met as if my life began again that day. It was a bright afternoon, the sun dipping lazily behind the cafe's awning. I was seated by the window, lost in a novel I don't even remember now, when his shadow fell across the table. I looked up, and there he was. Tall, charming, with a confident smile that somehow felt gentle. His voice was smooth, like a favorite melody you can't forget. He wasn't just handsome, he was magnetic. He made the world seem quieter. I remember laughing more that day than I had in months, surprised by how effortlessly he pulled me into his orbit. He asked me out by the end of our first conversation, and I said yes without hesitation. It was the kind of moment you don't overthink. You let yourself fall because, for once, it feels safe to do so. The early days of our love were everything I had dreamed of. We spent lazy Sundays watching old movies, holding hands in dim theaters where reality felt distant. He made me feel wanted in ways that melted away years of insecurities. When he kissed me, it wasn't just passion, it was devotion. And when he spoke of our future, I saw it too. A house with sunlight streaming through the windows, a family, quiet mornings wrapped in each other's arms. But life isn't a fairy tale, and I was blind to the shadows creeping in around the edges. The first sign was so small, so easily dismissed. We had just moved in together, a small apartment that felt like a fresh start. One morning, I was running late for work, rummaging through the closet for a dress. When I grabbed one I hadn't worn in ages, he frowned. "Why that one?" he asked, his voice too casual to raise alarm. I laughed it off. "I like it. What's wrong with it?" His smile stayed, but his eyes didn't. "Nothing. It's just, I prefer the blue one. You look beautiful in it." At the time, I thought it was sweet, a man with a preference, but it wasn't the last time. Slowly, the preferences became corrections. The corrections became rules. Don't wear that. Don't talk to him. Don't stay out too late. He framed it all in the language of love. "I just worry about you. I don't want people to get the wrong idea. You're mine, and I have to protect you." At first, I didn't notice how much of myself I was losing. I mistook control for care. I convinced myself that his possessiveness was a byproduct of how deeply he loved me. But love isn't supposed to make you smaller. And with each compromise I made, I felt myself shrinking, like a flower wilting under too much sun. The cracks deepened when I took a trip with my best friend, Lily. Just 2 days at the lake, something we had planned long before he entered my life. I had told him about it weeks in advance, and he had smiled and said, "Of course, you deserve a break." But when the day came, his smile was gone. "Why are you leaving me?" he asked, his voice so soft it felt like a knife cloaked in velvet. "I'm not leaving you. It's just 2 days." "You shouldn't go. We've already booked it." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could see the storm brewing behind his calm exterior, and when I left that day, I felt his eyes burning into my back. But I told myself it was fine. He would cool down. It wasn't a big deal. But when I came back, everything changed. He had broken into my phone, read every message between me and Lily. He knew about every laugh we shared, every silly complaint, every private thought. And he was waiting for me, seated in the dark with his hands folded, as if I were the guilty one. "Why didn't you tell me everything?" he asked quietly enough to terrify me. "There was nothing to tell," I whispered, my voice trembling. His hand reached for mine, not in tenderness, but like a warning. "You don't get to hide things from me, ever." That night, I felt something crack inside me. The man I fell in love with was gone, or maybe he had never been real. Maybe the charming, thoughtful man I met in that cafe was just a mask he wore until I was too far in to escape. After that, the isolation began. Slowly, methodically, he became the center of my world. He loved me so fiercely that it burned away everything else. My friends drifted away, confused by the sudden distance. My work suffered because I was always anxious about his approval. I felt like a butterfly pinned under glass, still beautiful, still breathing, but trapped. And every time I tried to push back, he'd remind me just how much I meant to him, his voice breaking as he'd say, "Don't you understand? I can't live without you. You're the only good thing in my life." It sounded like devotion, but it felt like a warning. The final straw came on a quiet evening. I don't even remember what started the argument. All I remember is the way he looked at me when I said I needed space. Something in his eyes broke, and in its place, something darker rose to the surface. "If you ever leave me, I'll find you." The words were whispered, not shouted, but I felt them like a cold hand around my throat. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moments that had led me here. I had always thought monsters were obvious, with teeth and claws. But sometimes, they wear the face of the person you love most. That was when I knew. If I didn't leave, I would disappear, not physically, but piece by piece, until nothing of me remained. But I also knew that leaving wouldn't be enough. He would search for me. He would never stop. I had to become someone who didn't exist. I had to die. And so, I began planning. The woman he loved would vanish into the earth, leaving only memories and ashes. And the real me? I would rise again, free. Or so I thought. It started small. It always does. Little moments that seemed harmless at first, just fleeting shadows in an otherwise bright sky. But shadows grow, don't they? And before you know it, they swallow the sun. The first time I felt true, fear wasn't during an argument. It was over something so trivial that, in hindsight, it almost seems laughable. I had forgotten to buy coffee. It was a Saturday morning. He liked his coffee strong and bitter, brewed precisely the way he'd shown me 100 times before. I'd gotten used to his routine, to the unspoken rules of our mornings together. But that day, I woke up early, distracted by the scent of fresh rain outside. I decided to walk to the market to clear my head, forgetting that we'd run out of coffee beans the night before. When I returned, he was already awake, sitting at the table, drumming his fingers in an eerily slow rhythm. His eyes locked on me the moment I walked through the door, his expression unreadable. "Where's the coffee?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I froze, holding up the bag of fruit I had impulsively bought at the market. "I forgot. I can go back." I didn't even finish the sentence before the bag slipped from my hands. The apples tumbled to the floor, but I didn't move to pick them up. I couldn't. His eyes, they weren't angry in the way normal people get angry. There was something colder there, something sharp and calculated. "You forgot," he repeated, standing up slowly. "Something so simple, after everything I've done for you." My heart began to pound, the air between us thickening. "I didn't mean to," I began, my voice faltering as he stepped closer. "You didn't mean to?" His lips curled into a mockery of a smile, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you'll say when you forget something more important? When you mess up something that actually matters?" "It's just coffee," I whispered, regretting the words the moment they left my mouth. He stopped inches away from me. I could feel the heat radiating off his body. His hand brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture that should have been comforting, but it wasn't. "No," he murmured, his fingers lingering on my cheek. "It's not just coffee, it's respect. It's proof that you care." I stood there, too afraid to move, afraid that any sudden action would trigger something worse. I knew this wasn't about the coffee. It never was. This was about control. His need to assert dominance in every corner of my life. From that day on, everything felt different. The walls of our home, once cozy and familiar, felt like they were closing in. Every step I took felt monitored. Every decision I made felt like walking through a minefield, unsure which step would set off the next explosion. He started noticing the tiniest things, whether I folded the towels the right way, whether I responded fast enough when he called my name. If I was even a few minutes late coming home, his mood would shift like a gathering storm. "Where were you?" he'd ask, his voice deceptively calm. "I told you, I ran an errand." "But you didn't text me." It slipped my mind. He'd lean in close, so close I could feel his breath against my skin. "You don't get to make me worry like that." Every word felt like a verdict. No apology I gave was ever enough. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His whispers were sharper than screams. And the scariest part was how easily he could switch from cold rage to tender affection. He'd wrap me in his arms after a tense silence, stroking my hair like nothing had happened. "I'm only hard on you because I care," he'd say. "I just want you to be better." And for a moment, I'd believe him. I'd tell myself that he just loved me too much, that maybe if I tried harder, things would go back to the way they were in the beginning. But the cracks only deepened. One night, I spilled a glass of wine on the carpet during dinner. I laughed nervously, reaching for a towel, but his expression stayed frozen, as if someone had pressed pause on his humanity. "Why are you so clumsy?" he muttered. "How hard is it to be careful?" "It was an accident." "There are no accidents." The words hit me harder than they should have. I didn't know how to respond anymore. My instinct to defend myself had withered under the weight of constant accusations. When he walked away, I thought the moment had passed. But later that night, I noticed the way he stared at the stain, as if it was a personal betrayal. And when I climbed into bed, I found the sheets pulled tight, cold and empty. He hadn't joined me. Instead, I heard him pacing in the other room, muttering to himself. That night, I didn't sleep. The threats came slowly, disguised as concerns. He didn't outright say I couldn't leave, but his words painted a clear picture. "You know how dangerous the world is," he'd say. "If something happened to you, I don't know what I'd do." "I trust you," he'd whisper, "but I don't trust anyone else." Every conversation felt like an elaborate chess game, where I was always a step away from losing everything. And I began to see it for what it was. Not love, but control wrapped in the illusion of devotion. The small warnings grew sharper. "If you ever make me feel like I'm not enough again," he whispered one night, his hand tightening around mine, "you'll regret it." I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to pull away, to scream, to run. But I stayed, because despite everything, I wasn't ready to admit the truth yet. I still clung to the idea that the man I loved could be saved from the monster he'd become. But monsters don't need saving. They need prey. And I was already caught in his web. The moment I decided to fake my death wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some grand, cinematic revelation. It was quiet, still. Like the seconds before you drown, when you realize the surface is too far away and you can either fight for air or let yourself sink. It was a Thursday evening. The sky outside was a soft shade of purple, and the world felt deceptively calm. But inside, everything was unraveling. We were supposed to have dinner together. I had cooked his favorite, pan-seared salmon, the way he liked it. I had set the table perfectly. The candles flickered, casting warm shadows over the dishes. I wanted everything to be flawless. But it didn't matter. He came home late, his tie undone, a strange coldness in his eyes. I could feel it the moment he walked in, the storm beneath his silence. "You didn't call me today," he said, tossing his keys onto the counter. "I was busy," I replied, trying to sound lighthearted. "I wanted to surprise you with dinner." His eyes flicked to the table, the candles, the effort I'd poured into making the evening perfect. And then, back to me. "Busy doing what?" The question wasn't innocent. It never was. "Work. Cleaning. You know, life." I smiled, hoping to diffuse the tension. He stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. That made it worse. When he was angry, his hands stayed hidden, as if the act of restraint was the only thing keeping them from lashing out. "Life?" he repeated, his voice unnervingly soft. "Is that what you call it when you ignore me?" My stomach twisted. I felt the room grow smaller. "I wasn't ignoring you," I whispered. He let out a bitter chuckle, brushing past me toward the table. In one swift motion, he picked up the wineglass I'd poured for him and let it fall. The shattering sound was deafening, glass shards scattering across the floor like broken promises. "This is what happens when you stop caring," he said, his voice thick with something darker than anger. Betrayal. I stared at the mess on the floor, and something inside me broke. Not like the wineglass, not sudden or loud. It was quieter. A slow, deliberate snap. "I can't do this anymore," I said before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air between us. He froze, his head tilting slightly, as if he hadn't heard me right. "What did you say?" My heart was racing, my hands trembling, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I can't live like this. I'm not yours to control. I never was." His face darkened. In that moment, I saw the truth, the monster beneath the mask. There was no love left in his eyes, only possession. "You're mine," he whispered, stepping toward me. "And if I can't have you, no one will." The words hit me like a blow. I backed away, but he followed, his presence suffocating. "You think you can leave me?" His voice grew louder, sharper. "You think you can walk out of my life like it's that simple?" My vision blurred with tears, but I stood my ground. "I'm leaving, whether you like it or not." The next moment was a blur. He grabbed my arm, hard. His grip was like iron, unyielding. Panic surged through me. I tried to pull away, but his strength was overwhelming. "You don't get to leave," he growled. "Not after everything." That was the moment I knew. He would never let me go. Not alive, at least. That night, after he finally stormed off to cool down, I sat on the bathroom floor, staring at my reflection. I looked like a stranger, my eyes hollow, my skin pale. I was already a ghost of who I used to be. If I stayed, I would die. Maybe not physically, not right away, but eventually. He would consume me until there was nothing left. But if I tried to run, he'd find me. His threats weren't empty. He had resources, connections, an obsessive need to keep me under his control. I couldn't just pack a bag and disappear. He'd hunt me down until the ends of the earth. Unless I was already dead. The idea was terrifying at first. Faking your own death isn't something normal people do. It's the kind of thing you see in movies, not in real life. But desperation makes you bold, and I was out of options. I spent the next few weeks planning every detail, carefully, methodically. I couldn't afford mistakes. I studied everything: accident reports, missing person stories, how bodies are identified. It was grim, but it was necessary. I knew he wouldn't believe I had simply vanished. He'd need proof, something undeniable. So, I created it. One night, when he was away on a business trip, I drove to the coast, far from the city, far from anyone who could recognize me. I left my car near the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring below. I placed a few personal items inside, things he'd recognize immediately: a scarf he bought me, a bracelet I always wore, my phone. I left the door slightly ajar, as if in haste. The note I placed on the dashboard was simple, vague, enough to be convincing. A few cryptic lines about being overwhelmed, about needing peace. Nothing too obvious, nothing too traceable. I knew how the story would play out. The police would find the car, the belongings, the note. They'd assume the worst, that I had driven off the cliff, that the ocean had claimed me. They'd never find a body, of course. The currents in that part of the coast were notoriously brutal. Searching was pointless. To the world, I would be gone. When I stepped away from the car that night, I felt strangely calm. I watched the waves crash against the rocks below and whispered a quiet goodbye. To my old life. To the girl I used to be. I walked away from the cliff without looking back, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and a few bills in my pocket. I had no plan beyond that moment, only a single truth burning in my mind. I was free. Or so I thought, because even death wasn't enough to escape him. The second I felt his eyes on me at the cemetery, the fragile world I had built came crashing down like a house of cards in a storm. My breath hitched in my throat as his lips curled into that knowing, cruel smile. He knew. Somehow, he knew. Run. The word blazed in my mind like a fire alarm, but my legs refused to move. I was frozen, trapped in that awful moment where everything slowed down. I could hear the rain tapping against the umbrella above me, the soft murmur of mourners drifting away, but all I could see was him. And then he took a step forward. That broke the spell. I spun around, pushing through the crowd, my heart pounding like a war drum. I didn't care who I shoved past or what they thought. All I knew was that I had to get out. The rain hit my face in sharp, cold needles as I burst out of the cemetery gates. My coat flared behind me, water soaking through it almost immediately. I could barely see through the blur of panic and rain, but I kept running. The streets were slick and empty, too early for anyone but ghosts. My chest burned as I ran through puddles, splashing water onto my shoes. I wasn't sure where I was going. I just needed to disappear. Again. I ducked into an alley, pressing myself against the cold, wet wall, trying to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was trying to break free from my ribs. I forced myself to slow my breathing. In, out, in, out. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but that didn't mean anything. He was smart, patient, calculated, and he always found a way. I needed a plan. Panic wouldn't save me. I forced myself to think. Where could I go? He already knew I was alive. That meant any place I had used, any familiar hiding spot, was out of the question. He'd have anticipated that. Think. The only thing I had was the bag I had hidden in a locker at the train station, an emergency stash of cash, a burner phone, and a change of clothes. I'd left it there in case this exact nightmare happened, but it was miles away. And every second I stayed still, felt like an invitation for him to catch me. I took a deep breath, wiped the rain from my face, and forced myself to move. I pulled my hood tighter over my head and walked fast, but not suspiciously. The train station was my only hope. Once I got there, I could change, blend in, buy a ticket anywhere, and vanish again. But deep down, I knew that I was already playing a losing game. He wasn't the kind of man who left loose ends. And to him, I wasn't just a loose end, I was his. The train station was nearly empty when I arrived. Just a few sleepy travelers and a bored-looking ticket clerk. I headed straight for the lockers, my nerves raw. I fumbled with the key hidden in my pocket, slipping it into the lock and yanking the door open. The bag was still there. Relief flooded through me as I grabbed it, ducking into the nearest restroom. I locked the door behind me and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My hair was soaked, clinging to my face. My eyes were wild, red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear. I looked like someone who had barely survived. I ripped off my wet clothes and changed into the dry ones in the bag, a simple hoodie and jeans. I tied my hair back, tucked it under a baseball cap, and shoved my wet things into the trash. Every second felt like a countdown. I pulled out the burner phone, powered it on, and took a deep breath before dialing a number I hadn't called in 2 years. Lily. She picked up on the second ring. Hello? Her voice was cautious. She didn't recognize the number. It's me, I whispered. There was a pause, and then, oh my God, is it really you? Tears burned in my eyes at the sound of her voice. I had missed her so much, but I couldn't let myself break down. Not yet. I need your help, I said, my voice trembling. He knows. He found me. I heard her sharp intake of breath. Where are you? The station, I replied. I can't stay here. I need to get out of the city. I'm coming to get you, she said without hesitation. No, I said quickly. It's too dangerous. I don't want you involved. You don't get to make that decision, she snapped. You're not doing this alone, not again. Minutes later, I was sitting on a bench near the platform, scanning the crowd for any sign of him. Every man in a dark coat made my heart skip a beat. I felt like prey in a forest full of hunters. But then I saw her, Lily, in an oversized hoodie, her hair tucked into a beanie. She looked just as frantic as I felt. She ran straight to me and pulled me into a hug. The warmth of it broke something inside me. For the first time in years, I felt safe. We're getting out of here, she whispered. Together. We boarded the next train heading north, away from the city, away from everything. The seats were uncomfortable, the windows fogged with condensation, but I didn't care. I sat beside Lily, my body still trembling from the adrenaline. He's not going to stop, I murmured. Lily grabbed my hand, her grip fierce. Then we'll make sure he never finds you again. But even as the train pulled away from the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place far away from the noise of the world, from the life I had buried along with my old name. Nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and the distant whisper of a river, it felt like the last untouched corner of the universe. I found it thanks to Lily, who knew someone, a forgotten place off the grid, with no phone lines, no neighbors, and no way for anyone to stumble upon it by accident. It was perfect. Or it should have been. The first few days in the cabin passed in a blur of exhaustion. I spent most of my time pacing the creaky wooden floors, checking and rechecking the locks on the windows and the door. I barely ate. I barely drank. I barely breathed. At night, the silence felt suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the cabin's old bones sent my heart racing. I would lie awake on the narrow bed, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. Sleep became a distant dream, a place I no longer trusted to take me safely. When sleep did come, it was shallow and cruel. I dreamed of footsteps outside the cabin, of the door handle turning slowly, of his voice whispering my name through the dark. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming into the emptiness. Mornings were the worst. When the sunlight filtered through the trees and illuminated the small, simple space, I felt hollow. No amount of light could erase the shadows in my mind. I was alive, yes, but it didn't feel like living. It felt like hiding. I tried to keep busy. I chopped wood, swept the floors, scrubbed the windows until my fingers bled. But no amount of work could quiet the thoughts racing through my head. The memories of his voice, his touch, the cold certainty that he wasn't done with me. "You're mine," he had said. Those words were tattooed on my soul. I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I ran, he would never stop looking. He wasn't just angry. I was an obsession he couldn't bear to lose. An obsession doesn't die. It festers. One night, after weeks of sleepless terror, I finally let my guard down. I don't know if it was exhaustion or the way the soft rain pattered on the roof like a lullaby, but I closed my eyes and drifted off. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept. But when I woke up, I wasn't in my bed. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Leather seats, faint traces of cologne, his cologne. My head was pounding, my wrists aching from something tight digging into my skin. I blinked against the dim light and realized I was in a car. His car. Panic surged through me, a cold wave that stole the air from my lungs. My hands were bound, and I was lying across the back seat. The world outside the window was a blur of trees and darkness. "No, no, no," I whispered, my voice hoarse. The driver's seat shifted slightly as he glanced at me through the rearview mirror. His face was calm, too calm. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice like velvet wrapped around steel. My stomach twisted into knots. "How?" My voice cracked. "How did you find me?" He smiled, an expression that had once felt like home, but now felt like the sharp edge of a blade. "You really thought you could hide from me forever?" he asked, almost amused. Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "You're insane," I whispered. He chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. "Maybe. But I told you, didn't I? You're mine." I pulled at the bindings on my wrists, but they wouldn't budge. "Where are you taking me?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "Home," he replied simply. "Where you belong." The road stretched on, endless and empty. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. Not yet. So, I did the only thing I could. I talked. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't love me. You just want control." His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel, the only sign that my words had hit a nerve. "I do love you," he said through clenched teeth. "I loved you enough to give you everything, and you threw it away." "Because you suffocated me!" The words burst out of me, raw and desperate. "You don't know what love is. You destroy everything you touch." He slammed his hand against the dashboard, the car swerving slightly before he corrected it. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. The silence that followed was deafening. My pulse was a drumbeat of terror, but I forced myself to breathe, to think. "Please," I whispered, "just let me go." His eyes met mine in the mirror, and for a fleeting second, I saw something flicker there. Doubt, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "It's too late for that," he murmured. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the engine fill my ears as I made myself a promise. If I ever got out of that car alive, I wouldn't run again. I wouldn't hide. I would fight. The car slowed, the bright neon lights of a gas station cutting through the thick darkness. My pulse spiked as I watched him pull into an empty parking spot near the pumps. The hum of the engine died, leaving behind a silence so loud it made my ears ring. He let out a long breath and turned to me, his expression calm but unnervingly cold. "Don't even think about trying anything," he said, his voice low and measured. "I'll be right back." I nodded, too afraid to speak. My hands were still bound, my body stiff from being crammed in the back seat for what felt like an eternity. He gave me one last glance before stepping out and shutting the door with a solid, final click. I watched him walk toward the convenience store, his silhouette framed in the harsh glow of the overhead lights. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, to fight, to do something, but I was trapped. And then, after a minute of unbearable silence, the car door opened. My heart jumped into my throat. For a terrifying second, I thought he had come back early, that he was testing me, waiting for me to make a mistake. But when I turned my head, I froze. It wasn't him. A figure in a black hoodie and a face mask leaned into the car, moving with quiet precision. "Stay still," they whispered, their voice calm but urgent. Their hands moved quickly, cutting the zip ties around my wrists with a small blade. "What? Who?" I stammered, completely overwhelmed. "No time," the stranger said, pulling me upright and guiding me out of the car. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move. Whoever this person was, they were my only shot at freedom. We slipped into a nearby SUV parked just out of sight from the store. I climbed into the passenger seat, my heart hammering as the driver's door slammed shut behind me. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see his figure chasing after us. But the gas station was shrinking behind us, empty and still. I turned to my rescuer, my chest tight with disbelief. "Who are you?" The figure pulled off their mask, and the air was stolen from my lungs. It was her. I knew that face, even after all these years. The same wide, expressive eyes, the sharp cheekbones, the familiar way she tilted her head. But it was impossible. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You can't be—" She gave me a small, sad smile. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "Isabel?" The name felt foreign on my tongue. I had only heard it spoken in hushed tones, in stories he told me late at night, his voice thick with grief. Isabel, his sister. The girl who had supposedly drowned when she was 17. The tragedy that had shaped so much of his darkness. But here she was, alive. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "But you're dead," I stammered. She let out a bitter laugh, her hands steady on the wheel. "No, I faked my death, just like you did." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. "Why?" Her eyes darkened. "Because he would have destroyed me if I didn't." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The puzzle pieces started to fall into place, but the picture they formed was worse than I had imagined. "He told me you drowned," I whispered, more to myself than to her. Isabel's jaw tightened. "That's what I wanted him to believe. It was the only way to get free. But I've been watching. I knew he'd never let go of you." Tears welled in my eyes, but I forced them back. "You've been following him?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the road. "For years. When I found out what he was doing to you, I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore." 1,000 questions swirled in my head, but none of them mattered. All that mattered was that I was in this car, alive, speeding away from the monster who had tried to own me. We drove in silence for a while, the trees blurring past in a dark haze. The weight of everything settled into my chest, the fear, the relief, the disbelief. "What happens now?" I asked finally, my voice small. Isabel's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Now, we end this." I turned to her, my stomach twisting. "End this? Isabel, he's not going to stop. You know that." Her eyes met mine, fierce and unyielding. "Exactly, which is why it's time we stop running." The determination in her voice sent a chill through me. She had spent years hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. And now, she was done hiding. But as much as I wanted to believe we could fight him, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far we ran, no matter what we did, he would always be one step behind. "What if he finds us again?" I whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the engine. Isabel reached over and squeezed my hand, her grip steady and reassuring. "Then we make sure he never hurts anyone again," she said. Her words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time in years, a small ember of hope sparked in my chest. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was the beginning of something stronger than fear. But deep down, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He was still out there, and the hunt was far from over. The airport was a blur of lights, noise, and motion. Announcements echoed over the speakers in a dozen languages, the steady hum of travelers blending into a background haze. I clutched the small bag Isabel had handed me, my heart still racing with the aftershocks of everything that had happened. We parked the SUV in a quiet lot far from the main entrance, slipping into the terminal unnoticed. Isabel moved with purpose, her posture calm but alert. Every step she took radiated confidence, but I felt like I was teetering on the edge of collapse. She guided me to a quiet corner near a row of check-in kiosks, away from prying eyes. "Here," she said, pulling out a slim envelope from her jacket. She handed it to me, and when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside were new passports, boarding passes, and IDs. Different names, different identities. The photo on the passport barely looked like me, my hair styled differently, my expression carefully neutral. But it was me enough to pass. "How?" I whispered, staring at the documents in disbelief. Isabel gave me a small, tired smile. "I've had a lot of time to prepare. After I disappeared, I learned how to cover my tracks. I promised myself that if anyone else ever needed to escape, I'd be ready." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes as I stared at her. Isabel had lived through the same nightmare, had walked through the same fire, and yet she had survived. She wasn't broken. She was strong, and now she was saving me. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice cracking. It felt like such a small thing to say in the face of everything she had done, but it was all I had. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to live." The flight was set to depart in less than an hour. Paris, first class. It felt surreal, like a dream too fragile to last. As we made our way toward security, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, convinced that at any moment I'd see him. "He's not here," Isabel said softly, noticing my unease. "You don't know that," I muttered. My voice shook despite my efforts to sound strong. She paused, turning to face me. Her eyes met mine, steady and calm. "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "I know how he thinks, and I know that right now he's still figuring out how you slipped through his fingers. By the time he realizes, we'll be gone. We're already ghosts to him." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we were safe, that this wasn't just another brief reprieve before he found me again. But the fear clung to me like a second skin. Security was a blur of scanners and indifferent glances. We passed through without incident, our documents accepted without question. Every beep of the machines, every glance from an airport worker felt like a threat. I kept expecting someone to pull me aside to say, "There's been a mistake." But no one did. Before I knew it, we were seated at the gate. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, showing the expanse of the tarmac where planes were lining up like great silver birds. I stared out at the blinking lights, letting the sight of them anchor me in the present. Isabel handed me a bottle of water and a snack, but I barely noticed. My hands were shaking, my thoughts spiraling. "He'll never stop," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "Even if he doesn't find me today, he'll keep looking. He'll always be looking." Isabel leaned in closer, her voice soft but fierce. "Let him look. We're going to a place where he can't follow. He's powerful, but he's not omniscient. He'll run out of leads, and when he does, he'll have no choice but to let go." "And if he doesn't?" I asked, the fear thick in my throat. She smiled, small but genuine. "Then we make him irrelevant. We build new lives. We find joy in places he'll never know exist. We win by living." When our boarding group was called, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Every step toward the plane felt surreal, like I was walking into a new life I hadn't quite accepted yet. The flight attendant greeted us with a polite smile as we handed over our tickets, and then we were inside, away from the chaos of the airport, away from the past. The first-class cabin was quiet, filled with soft lighting and plush seats. Isabel guided me to my window seat and settled in beside me. I buckled my seatbelt with trembling hands, staring out at the runway as the plane began to fill. "This is real." Isabel murmured, as if reading my thoughts. We're really doing this. I nodded slowly, the weight of it settling into my bones. I was leaving everything behind, again. But this time, I wasn't alone. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the plane began to taxi. My heart raced as the runway blurred beneath us, and then, with a sudden, powerful lift, we were airborne. The ground fell away, the city lights shrinking into a sea of darkness below. The cabin lights dimmed as we reached cruising altitude. Isabel leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for the first time since we'd left the gas station. I stared out at the endless night sky, my mind heavy with memories. The fear still lingered like a ghost at the edge of my consciousness, whispering that it wasn't over. But with every mile that passed beneath us, I felt it loosening its grip. "Where do we go after Paris?" I asked quietly. Isabel opened one eye and smiled. "Anywhere we want." Her answer felt like a promise. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of freedom, not just survival, but a life where I wasn't looking over my shoulder. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. And as the stars stretched endlessly above us, I almost believed her. The apartment was small, but cozy, a place where life felt manageable and real. The soft morning light would filter through the lace curtains, warming the hardwood floors as birds chirped outside. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. A quiet corner of the world where no one knew our names, our pasts, or our pain. Here, we could simply exist. The first few months in Europe were slow, deliberate. It was like learning to breathe again after being underwater for too long. Isabel and I spent our days furnishing the apartment, getting used to the language, and finding our rhythm. I remember the first time I laughed, really laughed, after everything. Isabel had slipped on a loose rug while trying to hang a photo and landed flat on her back. We both burst into hysterics, laughing until tears streamed down our faces. It was the first time in years that the tears didn't come from fear or grief. Little by little, the shadows of the past receded. We found jobs not long after settling in, Isabel at a cozy art gallery downtown, me at a local cafe that smelled like fresh croissants and cinnamon. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't care. For the first time in so long, I felt normal. I learned how to enjoy the little things again. Morning walks to the flower market, slow afternoons reading in the park, the quiet buzz of life happening all around me. And we weren't alone anymore. Isabel was always braver than I was when it came to letting people in. She was the first to date, a sweet, soft-spoken chef who made her smile like I'd never seen before. I was more cautious, hesitant to believe I deserved something so fragile as love after everything that had happened. But one day, a regular at the cafe, a kind-hearted man with warm eyes and an easy laugh, asked me out for coffee. And somehow, I said yes. Years passed in quiet contentment. The nightmares grew less frequent, the fear less suffocating. The monster I had once feared no longer haunted every corner of my life. Isabel and I talked about the past sometimes, but less and less as time went on. We stopped needing to relive it because we were too busy building something better. But the truth is, the fear never fully disappeared. It was always there, a quiet hum in the background of my mind. I still caught myself checking over my shoulder on my way home from work. I still avoided certain places, certain faces that reminded me of him. And though Isabel would always tell me, "He's not here, he's not coming," I couldn't silence the voice in my head that whispered, "He'll find you." Until the day everything changed. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the sun was bright in the sky. Isabel and I had spent the morning at the market, filling the apartment with fresh flowers and pastries. We had planned a lazy day, tea, blankets, and mindless TV. Isabel flopped onto the couch, flipping through channels until she found the news. The anchor's voice was calm, routine, as he read the day's headlines. I wasn't really paying attention, too lost in my book. But then I heard the name. His name. My heart froze. I looked up at the screen, and there he was. His face was older, but unmistakably the same. His eyes, once so calculating and cold, now looked hollow and resigned. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive suits anymore. He was in a prison uniform. Former businessman arrested in connection with multiple counts of stalking, coercion, and violence against multiple women. The words blurred together as my pulse raced. My vision tunneled as the screen cut to footage of him being led into a courtroom, shackled and stone-faced. I barely registered the reporter's voice, explaining how years of evidence had finally caught up to him, thanks to a brave woman who had come forward. He was behind bars. For the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt relief. Pure, unfiltered relief. I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding, my entire body sinking into the couch as the weight of years lifted off my shoulders. Isabel reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. Her eyes were filled with the same quiet disbelief I felt. "It's over," she whispered, almost like she was afraid to say it out loud. I nodded slowly, the truth settling into my bones. It's really over. And for the first time, I believed it. We turned off the TV and sat in silence for a long time, watching the golden afternoon light filter through the windows. It felt like the end of a chapter. No, the end of a book. The story we had been living for so long was finally over. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice soft but steady. Isabel smiled, her eyes warm. "We live, sweetheart, just like we promised we would." Tears filled my eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. We spent the rest of the day exactly as we had planned, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea, and watching movies that made us laugh. For the first time, the future felt wide open, unburdened by fear. In the months that followed, life blossomed in ways I hadn't expected. Isabel and I grew closer than ever, but we also let ourselves fully live our separate lives. I traveled for the first time in years, visiting seaside towns and bustling cities, collecting memories that were mine and mine alone. I built a career I was proud of, fostered friendships that felt real and safe. And love, the thing I had once feared would only ever be a cage, became something beautiful. The past would always be a part of me. The scars wouldn't magically disappear, but they no longer defined me. He had once tried to break me, to claim me, to make me disappear. But in the end, I was still here. We were still here. And for the first time in my life, I felt free.